Welcome to State Recording and Transformation. And today you are with me, Jun Tutima Pinyo Panasukun, as your moderator. Dear everyone, today we will be discussing about the urban development in sustainability. And our speaker today, we are honored to have Professor Dr. Stefan Greifings. He's of Institute of Spatial Planning from Departments of Spatial Planning, Dortmund University of Technology. He had a rich milestone in research with the spatial planning. And our speaker, Professor Dr. Stefan Greifings, also the members of the advisory board of the European Environment Agency and the full members of the German Academy of Spatial Planning and Research, member of the Architect Chambers of the Federal State of North Rhine-Westphalia, evaluator of BMBF, EPIC 6, EPIC 7, and Horizon 2020 calls, coordinators of 30 internationals and more than 18 national research projects. And we are now with our speaker. Welcome, Professor Dr. Stefan Greifings. สวัสดีค่ะ Guten Tag.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. And first of all, we'd like to convey our sincere appreciation. Thank you very much for having the time with us today. Your knowledge is everything that we would like to learn more about your legacies and your experiences. We would like to start with your project. According to ICOL-MA project, can you give us in more detail and introductions of your project?
Okay, it's a quite new one, which just started a couple of weeks ago, which means I can, of course, introduce you to the objectives and the participants of the project, but there aren't any results yet. That's, I guess, quite understandable. We want to address social inequalities, which have been deepened due to the impacts of COVID-19 and related response strategies in various countries, including Germany, Brazil, and South Africa. Our focus will be on three major cities: Berlin, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and Cape Town in South Africa. The starting point of our research is the fact that little research results exists on the impacts of the pandemic on the livelihoods of marginalized groups as a result of constraints in mobility and access to public infrastructure services. That is our basic idea, to investigate on, of course, unintended negative side effects on livelihoods of marginalized groups, particularly those who settle in informal settlements around major cities in Brazil and South Africa. In Berlin, there aren't any informal settlements, but nonetheless, some city quarters which are characterized by a certain, let's say, lack of social stability and populated primarily by those who benefit from public subsidences. And of course, although there are differences regarding the political response strategies to COVID-19, we wanted to compare them in respect to their efficiency and, as I said, unintended negative impacts on livelihoods. We wanted to develop a more holistic understanding how these cities have been affected differently according to different legal institutional settings, different social demographic structures, but also to investigate on similarities, particularly regarding these marginalized groups. Of course, there are also tremendous opportunities that have been created, and particularly in terms of virtual access to services, also to educational services, that have to an extent also impacted the livelihoods. Probably they even benefited from that because physical access to public infrastructure services, which has been negatively affected by shutdowns of public transport systems, is less relevant and less serious in view of existing virtual communication techniques. Of course, there's an interdisciplinary consortium with partners from the University of Dortmund, University of ABC in Sao Paulo, and University of Cape Town. We are spatial planners, experts in social sciences, but also geographers, transport planners, and even some sociologists. And that enables us to address this quite complex problem really holistically. There are plenty of potential outcomes of the research. First of all, a so-called livelihood framework for pandemic response, for coping with sudden pandemic shocks and for improving the resiliency and sustainability of societies, which hopefully also enables societies to improve their capacity to adapt to similar shocks in future. I mean, as you may know, we are currently facing the first real war in Europe since 80 years, and that is, of course, also a shock, which impacts, it's a lot of impacts on the livelihoods in view of the millions of refugees which left already Ukraine and migrated to Western European countries. Second, we wanted to come up with a comparative analysis of livelihood coping mechanism during and post-pandemic situations. To what extent are marginalized livelihoods able to cope with extreme shocks and to withstand the negative social effects? We wanted to investigate on that. And finally, of course, we also aim at policy recommendation on improving the resiliency of livelihoods of marginalized groups and reducing the mobility-related negative impacts of shutdown policies like those who were adopted during the COVID-19 crisis.
The concept of the project is so amazing because with an aim to enhance the opportunity to the social equality and by the people in many countries, not only in German, but this concept can help the people by all. Really appreciate your hard work as well. Because that, we would like to learn more from the points about the overview of your professional and your role as a members of advisory boards of the European Environment Agency in terms of the urban development and mobility in German. Okay. Could you please share with us about the trends now today? Is it changed a lot during the impacts of COVID-19?
Okay, the work for the European Environment Agency was primarily related to adaptation to climate change. I have been advisor in respect to the status reports on European vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. That is one of the many tasks the European Environment Agency is dealing with. It hasn't been related to COVID-19 at all or to mobility. Partly to urban environments, since, as you may know, urban environments are seriously affected by climate change, particularly regarding urban heat and flash floods, which is a more and more relevant problem due to the sealed surface. Many major cities are characterized by, including those in Thailand, Bangkok, for instance, suffers a lot from monsoon rainfall and lack of appropriate sewer systems. Mobility patterns, of course, have changed, are still changing due to COVID-19 in many countries, including Germany. Particularly, not only because of lockdown policies and restrictions, also the need to wear always face masks while commuting in transport, public transport. These are negative impacts on the effectiveness of public transport. That's why the mobility patterns in Germany have changed a little bit backwards to primarily car-based transport. There's that is, of course, a quite problematic development in view of our European and national climate protection goals. The transport sector is the sector that really lacked of any sufficient and successful strategies for reducing annual greenhouse gas emissions. There's been a lot of success regarding the industrial sector, housing sector, agricultural sector, but not the transport sector. And that is primarily because the transport is still very much dominated by motorized individual vehicles, car transport, which is, of course, still very popular in Germany for various reasons. And the people, of course, still feel much safer when traveling in their own individual car instead of sharing public transportation in buses or railways. That is not really proved by statistics. There's no real evidence that from a health point of view, making use of public transport is risky. There aren't any statistics on that. It's a quite common knowledge nowadays that the most dangerous places in terms of infection risks are bars, restaurants, any in-house meetings, of course also schools and kindergartens, but not public transport. Nonetheless, there is some fear, at least from a subjective perspective, and that is not only the case in Germany, but in many other countries. That also has negatively affected economic performance of public transport companies. They are more and more dependent from public subsidies in order to be able to sustain the public transport as such, which is, economically speaking, there's an enormous deficit. And that has been enlarged a lot due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is a major burden for the public budgets, primarily for the municipal budgets, because the municipalities are responsible for organizing and financing the public transport in Germany. It's not up to the national government.
Here in Thailand, we had a similar scenario, but quite different from Germany. But from your use case that you mentioned about, I think that in the future, in Thailand can apply what happened in Germany to adopt in Thailand too. So we have this next question. We'd like to ask you and learn more about your perspective. How do you engage the local stakeholders, whether it's public or the private or government sector, in there any specific concern or challenge you would like to share? Because the world is changing rapidly nowadays. Could you please share with us about this?
Of course, we have been responsible for stakeholder involvement in many projects, from the very local to the international level. Of course, there are different stakeholders which have to be involved depending from the spatial scale, the objectives, and cultural characteristics of the area under investigation. A quite popular approach for involving local stakeholders nowadays are so-called real-life laboratories, or living labs in short, which means that we investigate on a certain topic collaboratively with the stakeholders and the local public. There isn't any client or contractor anymore. It's more a need for a mutual understanding on the problem under investigation, the appropriateness of various research approaches, and a need for collaboratively developed solutions in order to make sure that the results are really convincing from the perspective of the locals. In many cases, particularly in Germany, which is a country which is characterized by, to a certain extent, by an existing building stock. There isn't any considerable new development, opposite to emerging economies like Thailand, which means that the effectiveness of mandatory top-down measures is quite limited due to the existence of private property rights, which are guaranteed by our constitution law. That means that anything which is related to the existing building stock has to be, or the appropriateness or usefulness of measures like protection or adaptation to climate change or improving the livelihood is up to autonomous households and individual decisions, which means that we have to convince the addressees of our solutions from the usefulness and from the added value of these solutions from their individual perspective, which requires a much more intensive communication instead of just order. We can't order anybody to implement anything in at least not in existing cities and built up environments. And that is not only the case for us as scientists, but even more importantly for the municipalities themselves, which means that spatial planning or urban development nowadays in Germany is very much a collaborative task based on such kind of communication-related activities. In other cases where our partners are primarily administrative stakeholders, but not the general public, we work with so-called gaming simulations. Another term in English is serious gaming, which means that we wanted to simulate plan approval procedures in order to test the applicability of innovative solutions, innovative methods, tools, new instruments, as realistic as possible by involving all those stakeholders which play a role in reality in terms of a real plan approval procedure according to Federal Building Code, for instance. That is a more and more popular and also quite effective way of involving administrative stakeholders. We are currently working with gaming simulations in various projects, for instance, a project on cultural heritage in flood-prone areas. There's a clash of interests between cultural heritage preservers and flood risk managers. Any change in the visual element of the protected cultural heritage runs counter to the interests of the heritage preservation, but is necessary in order to mitigate potential negative impacts on the built heritage. And that is really a quite problematic situation. And we are going to simulate potential solutions in a couple of weeks in a medieval town, which was heavily affected by a river flood a year ago. Another gaming simulation I was responsible for took place in context of the so-called Federal Spatial Flood Protection Plan. I conceptualized on behalf of the federal government in the last year, and we successfully tried to simulate the effects of this federal plan on lower authorities, on regional planning, on local land use planning, by discussing concrete planning cases. Another quite popular tool for engaging local stakeholders are so-called needs assessments. Ideally, already during the preparation of a collaborative project proposal, importantly, you need to investigate on the concerns and interests of the practitioners. What matters from their perspective? What are potential, let's say, win-win settings where we as researchers, but also the practitioners, benefit from a potential collaboration? That needs to be investigated as early as possible as a negative example, I was involved a couple of years ago in a so-called Marie Curie research training network. It's like a graduate school. It was funded by Under Horizon 2020. Graduate school means that we were responsible for, in total, 12 PhD students from various disciplinary backgrounds. Some of them had a degree in geography, others in geology and engineering, and so on. I asked all candidates the same question. What are your addressees for target groups? Sorry, that's my cat. They hesitated quite a couple of seconds, and all of 12 of them came up with the same answer. My addressee is my supervisor. What does this mean? That none of them was really aware about his or her target group, for whom his or her research would matter in reality. Nobody had an idea about that. And that indicates really also a clash of culture, a clash of scientific culture, or on the one hand, and the interests of the practitioners, or the reality on the ground. And that is a really important shortcoming. If you are not aware about the concerns and needs, what is really needed on the ground, you can't tailor-made your product, your findings to these needs.
Yes, I really appreciate about your guidance, because the idea and the mindset will come out to that. So we now, this is the best way to engage with the local stakeholder, and whether in public and private or the government sector, we have, which is the main idea, because to drive the economic growth and the value perspective by have the mutual understanding and the mutual concept and responsibility, because that your guidance we can apply and adopt for the urban development, for sustainability in the future as well. And I really appreciate that you have the scenario about stimulate and think beyond reality. When we have the challenges we facing, we have to think beyond it, think more than more we face it now today. That would be the good idea. We can apply it. Okay. So because you are the expert in spatial planning, we would like to in depth and go in detail from your experience as well. We'd like to ask you about what is your key success to the project you are working on, because you have responsibility and you are the consult for many projects before. Could you please share with us about the key success to be translated into the other 60 in the world? Your expertise from your SY, not only in German, but you have opportunity to work in many countries, so that, like you mentioned at the beginning, in Brazil, in South Africa. And do you have any advice or the key success for the country like us in Asia?
Okay, of course, I have been involved in dozens of projects internationally and nationally. It's quite challenging to sum up all findings to one or two key factors for success. Just to give you an example, I have been also coordinator of projects in Asia. For instance, a joint project with colleagues in Thailand, in Vietnam, and in the Philippines on dealing with informal settlements in hazard-prone areas. Another new project will be on climate-sensitive land use planning under the International Climate Initiative of the federal government of Germany, and one of the participating countries again is Thailand. Recently, one of my Thai PhD students came up with a very interesting PhD study on the potential impacts of climate-related hazards on urban public health services, particularly the interaction of changing hazards and a changed urban development in the future, because that is also a key message for investigating on climate impacts and risks. It's not sufficient to study the climate change itself. The land use related changes are even more important for determining local impacts of climate change. It's the land use that matters for today's and future climate impacts, as I mentioned already regarding the problem of sealed surfaces, insufficient sewage systems, or the fact that cities like Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, or Jakarta are confronted with more and more flooding. It's not because sea level rise, it's because of local land use related decisions. And that underlines this statement. If you wanted to know more about future climate change impacts, you need to be aware about future urban development trends. And by adjusting future urban development, you can also adapt to climate change. And that was primarily the focus of her dissertation, the interaction between urban development and climate change. And she did it quite collaboratively with a lot of stakeholders who are responsible for the urban healthcare system in the city of Khon Kaen in northeastern Thailand. And she made use of scenarios, participatory scenarios. She developed collaboratively with these stakeholders. And I guess her study has a certain impact on the urban health policy in Khon Kaen and beyond in Thailand. The other example I recently mentioned was on behalf of the federal government, this federal spatial flood protection plan, which has been really a paradigm shift because traditionally flood risk management in Germany was very, let's say, technical oriented, defense oriented, solely focusing on the weather component, excluding the vulnerability aspect. We introduced a risk-based approach for the first time in Germany, which means that there's nowadays a need for tailor-made land use related decisions which take the vulnerability of the various land use types, but also specific critical infrastructures fully into account. And that is has been a paradigm shift. Another example, we successfully introduced so-called sustainability checks in various cities, which means that any public decision on anything, not only on land use, but also on budgetary issues, have to be checked for its impacts on sustainability, meaning economic, ecologic, and social impacts, and not solely a climate check, which tends to exclude the unintended negative effects of climate protection and adaptation on marginalized groups. The marginalized groups contribute less to climate change in terms of their ecological footprint, but are much more negatively affected by the consequences of climate change in view of a lack of resources to cope with these effects. And that is, of course, also true for developing countries and emerging economies. And that's why we are really in favor of a holistic sustainability check. And that has successfully been implemented as a legally binding tool by a couple of municipal boards based on our research.
That's very interesting because the projects and activities that you have introduced to us, it's valuable to apply and adopt for the urban development in the country as well. And we really appreciate your hard work that you have the opportunity to give us the knowledge and work with Khon Kaen City. Because
There's also another interesting field of research, which is about critical infrastructures or criticality. Many people tend to still to focus on sustainability or sustainable development although resiliency becomes a more and more important key term and concept, for instance, when looking at the agenda or the sustainability goal 11 or the Sender framework for disaster risk management. But in reality, in many cases, conflicts between sustainability and resilience were overlooked or not addressed at all. Mobility is a very good example for that. I guess everybody would agree that public transportation is a more sustainable way of organizing mobility as individual car-based transport. Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, public transport systems, particularly those which have their own tracks, are less resilient because in case of an extreme event that may question the operability of the system, a single event could negatively affect the functionality or operability of the entire public transport system, while individual transportation is much more redundant. There are more alternative routes. And that is a very important finding that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking and discussing about future mobility system or transportation systems. We came up with this idea in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania 2 years ago. Dar es Salaam is a mega city in Tanzania. It's not the capital city, but the largest city in terms of population. Nobody really knows. It's something between 5 and 10 million inhabitants. Based on the World Bank finding, the city came up with the so-called bus rapid transit system, which is a quite modern and very popular way of organizing public transport. It's really efficient and quite speedy during normal, ordinary times. But since existing flood risk was totally ignored when designing the network, the system isn't stable and reliable because the tracks are frequently affected by monsoon flooding. And in this respect, the traditional so-called Dala bus system, small buses, I guess similar systems exist in Thailand, operated by private owners, is a much more reliable and redundant way of organizing public transport. The more modern an economy becomes, the more dependent the economy is from critical infrastructure services. For instance, power supply wasn't relevant at all for African cities a couple of years ago. Due to the lack of reliability of power supply, individual power generators become more and more important in these countries, which are, of course, characterized by a very negative ecological footprint because they are powered by diesel in most cases. There are so many potential negative unintended effects of modernization, of mobility, but also of the economy as a whole. These consequences underline the necessity to understand better potential cascading effects of service disruptions. And that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about resiliency and sustainability. And we did so not only in Dar es Salaam, but also in Lima and in Quito, which are the two capital cities of Peru and Ecuador in Latin America, and came to similar findings.
Yes, so we have to think about resiliency for sustainability, and the mobility will be another chapter, but it will be a new game changer of our world too. So we'd like to, moving on for the next question, would like to ask for your experience too, because now today we have to apply everything, and the world is changing rapidly, as I mentioned at the beginning. How would you like to sustain your project or initiative? Could you please share your strategy or thought with us for developer, researcher, and for citizen in our country, or who are in this urban development for sustainability?
Of course, there are very traditional ways of disseminating results. I'm talking about peer-reviewed journal papers. That is a traditional and most effective way of sustaining, from a scientific perspective, your project and ideas into spreading them out to a wider community. But of course, not an appropriate strategy for targeting local communities. For real impacts, research results need to be integrated in policy documents or policy strategies, and importantly, in the best case, legally binding instruments, such as land use plans. That, of course, guarantees further sustainability and the real impact of project results on the ground, but of course requires an appropriate understanding how these instruments function, particularly from an, let's say, legal point of view, which means that an planner should also somehow be trained in law, in planning law. That is not always the case. Of course, another way of sustaining projects or initiatives is through physical measures. Of course, there are existing funding schemes. They are normally organized nationally and, of course, differently in different countries. Although in the European Union, there are also some supranational funding programs, particularly for environmental policy. But in Germany, for instance, there's a particular program on urban renewal, which is a quite important one in view of the dominance of already existing built-up areas and building stock. And through this urban renewal funding, we successfully applied together with some of our partners in terms of municipalities for financial support, and were able to implement physical measures through this renewable funding scheme. For instance, recently for a so-called emergency waterway in a smaller municipality. This was a measure which is related to urban flooding. Heavy rainfall cannot be handled by the underground sewage system. There are alternative or additional measures necessary for the avoidance of damage on the building stock, and that is in this case was a surface emergency waterway, which is designed for releasing the water from the city center into open space in order to avoid damages to the building stock. This is, of course, a quite technical one, but in some cases, technical solutions are still the only effective one. Although I don't really want to question the appropriateness of nature-based solutions. Another city, we came up with a completely different physical measures. It was about so-called wandering trees, mobile trees, which can be placed during heat waves at public places, for instance, in order to mitigate urban heat locally, improving the livelihood for the local population, and be removed during the winter season to greenhouses, for instance. That was another kind of physical measure we came successfully up with together with the municipality.
Well, great. We have so many things to apply in Davidus, because we have to work together, and now we know that how to sustain our project from your strategy and your thought that you share with us. Professor Dr. Stefan, we have heard that you have 2 projects related on the climate change. We have another project. Would like to learn more from you about introduction of the project, ANFO, strategy to adapt to the impacts of drought in elephant. The project duration start from June 2020 to in the next year. Could you please give us introductions about it for more? This project that in Thailand, we think that we can apply this climate change project from you.
Okay. First of all, climate adaptation in Germany has been successfully integrated into urban development, primarily in major cities, because it requires a certain level of expertise, sufficient resources in terms of personnel and financial resources, and that is not the case in the rural regions and smaller villages and municipalities. And that's why many of our recent projects still have a focus on the rural on rural regions. That is not only the case in the UNFO project, but also with the Evolving Region projects. This Evolving Region project targeted also rural counties in order to spread out existing knowledge and competences from the more urbanized, from the larger towns to the rural villages. It's a kind of knowledge transfer to more rural environments. Olfen is also a small city with about 12,000 inhabitants only, located in a rural region north of the Ruhr agglomeration. And by the way, not by chance, my hometown. The mayor is a personal friend of mine. That's why I was able to convince him from the usefulness of this collaborative project. But this is just as a side information. The problem with dry spells or droughts in Germany is a quite new one. And obviously an effect of ongoing climate change. From 2018 till 2020, we experienced the most serious drought since more than 350 years in Germany. And the consequences of droughts are tremendously. They negatively affect not only the urban environment, but also the open space. The forests, agricultural production, drinking water resources, and also inland waterway transport, energy production with not only hydropower, but also other thermal power plants, which are dependent from cooling water for their processes. For many industrial processes, steel production, for instance, water is a key resource. That indicates the seriousness of this newly arising effects of climate change. And we really want to address these consequences holistically, which means that this project targeted not only urban development, but also landscape development, agriculture, forestry, and industrial processes. First of all, we analyzed the potential impacts, the potential local impacts of lack of available water resources on the various sectors in Olfen. Based on these results, we organized some workshops with local stakeholders in order to combine our scientific evidence with local knowledge. Local expertise is quite important for identifying local hotspots or potential solutions, which of course need always to be set up in a tailor-made way to the local needs and local requirements. We are currently in the phase of setting up strategies. There will be a next workshop prior to the summer break with the same group of stakeholders. Our ultimate goal is to come up with a jointly developed strategy and related measures for the different sectors. And at the very end of the project, we wanted to create some pilot measures, which means that we really want to implement them physically, collaboratively with landowners, and not only landowners in the urban environment, but also with farmers and owners of the various forests in the city. And these are primarily private owners. The majority of the forests in Germany is owned by private persons, not by municipalities or by the state itself. And that complicates the situation a lot because you can't order. As I said earlier, you have to convince the private landowners from the importance of appropriate adaptation measures.
Very interesting, because major cities in Thailand are now facing the climate change crisis too, and they fight to find any solution to solve that issue. For example, they try to find a solution for the water management. Yes. Another project that we would like to ask you to give us the introductions about CISCA, integration of systemic criticality into disaster management planning, because in Thailand we try to find any project or solution to apply to about the disaster management too. Could you please guide us?
This project is primarily related to critical infrastructure. I mentioned the importance of an improved knowledge on potential cascading effects earlier today. When looking at the economic consequences of mega disasters in the past, including the floods in Bangkok in 2011, according to World Bank reports, it's apparent that the economic losses were not primarily caused by direct physical damages of the building stock, but by disruptions of global supply chains. In 2011, for instance, Bangkok was one of the global hubs for semiconductor production. And disruption of supply of semiconductors negatively affects, of course, almost every economic sector in the world. And these indirect cascading effects on other sectors, even located outside the exposed area, really matter. And they are under-investigated. And in most cases, not appropriately addressed neither by disaster risk management nor by climate change adaptation strategies. And that is why we really try to improve the local knowledge on potential effects of service disruptions by identifying cause-effect chains for every critical infrastructure sector, by relating these cause-effect chains spatially to the various parts of the city, and by validating the findings through workshops with infrastructure operators. We did so already in other cases, for instance, in Lima. We did also a criticality assessment, particularly was a focus on the electricity supply infrastructure. While the project in the CISCA project approach is a bit more holistic, really wanted to address all infrastructure sectors, which is possible due to the local setting and the involvement of the various infrastructure operators, which are primarily owned by the city. For instance, the sewage system operator, electricity supply, public transport, healthcare system, and so on and so forth. All of these companies are owned by the city, which means that we do have access to the data and to the people, because this CISCA project is a collaboration between the University of Dortmund and the city of Bochum. And as I indicated earlier, we really wanted to influence the disaster risk management policy in Bochum by integrating our findings into the local disaster risk management plan, which is a legally binding document. This is a project which consists of two phases. Currently, there's a preparatory phase ongoing, which is primarily about this criticality assessment and identification of adaptation needs. But there will be a follow-up main phase. And during the 4 years main phase, we will benefit from much more financial funds, which could also be used for physical interventions. And that is seldomly the case in research projects. Up to 5 million euro will be available for physical interventions. And that is, of course, let's say, a real incentive for the city, or for the contribution of the city.
I totally agree with you. We have to think about the future and the next generations of for making the better world. Thank you very much. Because your knowledge sharing and your experience is worth to describe today. Thank you very much for joining with us for today's program in City Decoding and Transformation. We hope that every single word that you have mentioned and you're sharing with us, we can apply for the future of our world for making the world is a better place. We would like to convey our appreciation. Thank you very much to you once again, Professor Dr. Stefan Greifing. Thank you very much for joining with our program today.